Humans have been at war since the beginning of recorded history. The tools and tactics may have changed, but the results are the same: death, immense suffering, devastation, and trauma. Is it a cycle we can break? I'm Soraya Salam, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
In war, you always have to draw a line between us and them, or else you wouldn't know who to kill.
Our understanding of what war is really needs to evolve. Our understanding of what violence is needs to be front and center when we have these conversations about war.
The world is still a violent place full of terrible things that are going on. We should expect things to get worse, not better.
It's almost like you took the human out of humanitarian law, but kept their finger on the trigger. I think this is the most distressing thing about AI.
Our debate today: is war inevitable? I'd like to welcome our guests, Ian Morris, author of War, What Is It Good For?, and professor of history at Stanford University. Charlie Carpenter is a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Brian Ferguson, a professor of anthropology at Rutgers University, Newark. And Noha Abuldahab, assistant professor of international law at Georgetown University in Qatar. Thank you all for being here. So, is war inevitable? Will we ever be able to overcome war as a human civilization? Brian?
I don't think war is inevitable. I say this for three reasons. One is that a lot of people do think war is inevitable. And so I spent quite a bit of my life studying the different bases of those claims, which include tribal warfare, which include the archaeological record on war, and which includes violence among chimpanzees. And what I found is that in all three of those, the claim that war is somehow acting out an innate tendency doesn't hold water, doesn't explain things. Human beings, and maybe even chimpanzees, learn war by the culture they're in, by their history, by present circumstances, and by what leaders tell them. So there can be other choices. And I also think that it's not inevitable because even complex societies have existed without war, although before recorded history, in the earliest civilizations, like the Indus Valley civilization, like Ubaid that preceded Sumer, and like Caral on the coast of Peru, which is the earliest of the Andean civilizations. And lastly, I think you can see war is not inevitable by the current world. Europe and the integration of the European community gets a lot of attention, but you could look at South America as well. Those countries have made war on their own citizens, but in terms of wars between states, there hasn't been a big one since the Chaco War almost a century ago.
Noha?
I think war is inevitable to an extent, especially in the context of self-defense. I mean, if you're attacked, I feel like if we're talking about innate instinct is to defend yourself. And so in that sense, I would go even further and say in that sort of context, war is necessary to defend yourself in those types of instances. So, yeah.
Ian, will there always be a reason for us to go to war?
Well, I think, no, like Brian, I think war is not inevitable, but there are a lot of buts that go around that. And I think, to me, it seems like two big things are really important. One is that people are animals. And like almost all other species of animals, we've evolved to be able to use violence to get what we want in the world if we choose to do so. And so in that way, we're just like any other animal. But then there's also a way in which we're not like any other animal. which is that our evolution has given us these big brains that are capable of cultural evolution as well as biological evolution. And we can decide how we do things. And we, so far as we know, alone in the entire world, we are the only animal that has changed the amount of violence it uses and the ways it uses it over time. And there's a lot of argument over the statistics. I'm sure this is going to come up in the debate today. But the way I look at the evidence, people today, in spite of all the wars and the cruelty going on in the world, on average, globally, we are about 1/10 as likely to die violently as our ancestors in the Stone Age were. And I think we know how to drive down rates of violent death if we choose to do so. And so I think the possibility of a world without war is a real one, although, as I say, there's a lot of buts around that.
Charlie, what do you think?
I think conflict is inevitable, but violent conflict is not. I would agree with that. I hope it's not, because we're not living in the Stone Age anymore. We are living in a nuclear-armed world where even non-nuclear aerial weapons can do incredible damage to entire cities. We saw that in Dresden, Tokyo. We're seeing it in Gaza even. So if civilization is going to survive, we need very serious checks and balances on war. And that's what the United Nations Charter since 1945 has tried to do, limiting war to very specific last resort instances like self-defense. That's what the Geneva Conventions have tried to do since the mid-19th century, limiting how you can fight even a just war. You know, you can't target civilians, you shouldn't torture prisoners, you shouldn't use weapons that degrade the environment, etc. And these rules are what distinguish war from murder and from genocide. They've also, in statistical terms, helped keep the lid on not only interstate war, but especially great power war, the most deadly kind of war, for almost 80 years. And so I think abandoning those rules for a more untrammeled realpolitik would be a choice that would lead to a much more dangerous world and undo a great deal of progress that we've seen in the last 2 centuries especially.
Could I just,
Please.
so I'm interested to know when, for example, Ian, when you say we're 1/10 unlikely to die violently now, when you talk about violent death, what is that exactly? Is it being shot and killed or bombed in the context of an ongoing armed conflict? Because the reason I raise this is war doesn't really have a definitive, I mean, oftentimes it doesn't have a definitive beginning and a definitive end, right? And there are reverberations that take place long after, war has quote unquote ended. And those reverberations do cause violent death, whether it's, starvation or disease or, lack of access to health services because of the destruction of infrastructure and so on. So I'm just curious to know, like, what is your definition of a violent death?
Yeah, I think so much of this debate, I think, does come down to definitions, which is maybe the most boring thing that academics do is argue over definitions. But if you don't, then you are kind of wasting your time. And so I think everybody who looks into the problem tends to define things slightly differently. So it's really important always to be as explicit as you can. And I mean, war itself, how you define what the war is, I mean, that's obviously a central question. And when I started getting interested in this problem, I began to feel pretty quickly that making a distinction between war and other forms of violent death was not always the right way to go. And both in a sort of practical sense that if you reach across the table and pound my head in with a stone axe now, it makes very little difference to me whether that's an act of war defined legally that way or whether it isn't. Violent death is violent death. But then the other big issue, just as a sort of practical research one, is that so much of this argument comes down to archaeology. If you're going to trace it back any distance in time, you've got to be working with archaeological evidence. And you dig up a skeleton, say, and you can tell this is certainly the victim of violent death. Say it's a big, deep trauma fractures on the left side of the skull, probably delivered by a right-handed person using a stone axe, breaks in the left arm, we call them parry fractures, where someone has raised their arm to defend themselves, almost certainly victim of a violent attack. But whether that's a violent attack by a foreign state or whether that's your brother getting angry with you over dinner, there's absolutely no way to tell. So I've always thought that getting too bound up with the issue of what counts as war and what doesn't deflects us from the really important thing, which is what is the rate of violent death in the world. But even that is still only the beginning of the argument, because as you say, do you count the number of people who say have died of disease and starvation in the course of a war, which probably up till 1918, every war in the history of the world, probably more people died of disease and starvation than of direct violence. So if you don't count the disease and starvation, then you're going to get a really weird perspective on what's going on. But the minute you start down that path, it gets just practically more difficult, because that's not something you can often tell directly from the archaeological record. So I think, yeah, every question that comes up today, the definitional issue is going to be crucial.
And if I could jump in, one of the things that Ian and I disagree on is the Stone Age rate of violent death. And he has relied on very widely accepted sources that say that if you look at the archaeological record, somewhere between 15 and 25% of adults die of violent death. That's a widely quoted figure. I've looked at the original sources, and I find it is much, much less than that. And so I would say that the number of violent deaths in the Stone Age would be more like 2%. Now, that, agreeing with Ian, begs the question of whether this is an individual violent act. Even more fuzzy in our definitions is whether it's part of a feud, and can feud be distinguished from war, or war. So there's a number of factors you have to look at to get to a probable answer in the archaeological record of whether there's war going on. But I think what I find is that if you go back to the earliest archaeological records, I entirely agree with your initial statement about recorded history being a record of war. But if you go back to the earliest archaeological record, you do not find evidence of war. And then you find evidence of war coming into the record. And so the question is, why does that happen?
But why haven't we been able to prevent war? Has it been a failure of imagination then? Perhaps even moral courage?
Well,
if you're saying that
yeah.
it's not innate to humans.
See, one of the things that's going to, I think, come up through our conversation here is time frame. And I'm looking back to the 10,000 years ago. And I'm looking across the world to all kinds of societies. And if you're looking at the modern world or the historical world, you're going to get different answers to a lot of questions. In the tribal universe that we can assess how they handle conflicts, there are very well-developed means of conflict resolution or conflict avoidance. So there have been ways to avoid these. And going back to the Emirates, when I'm not an expert on the Emirates, but I did a little reading, and what I see is
the Gulf states, right? Yeah.
The how much conflicts are ended through negotiation, as opposed to Western civilization, which has tended to say obliteration or capitulation has got to be the end of the war. It's not. It doesn't have to be. There can be ways of preventing war, even in the modern world, or bringing it to an end when it's gotten started.
Can you give some examples?
Of where?
Of when war has been prevented in the manner that you're mentioning?
Well, let me talk for a minute about the archaeological record. Well, the ethnographic record. One of the biggest things in war avoidance and getting away from war is people remove themselves from the conflict situation. Even a person kills another person within their own band or their own social sphere, might provoke an immediate violent counter-reaction. But if he leaves for 6 months or a year and comes back, usually that is blown over. There's a lot of conflict resolution mechanisms that involve sort of mock battles. This is something that's very impressive in the Australian continent, where people bombard each other with spears, but very few people get hurt. You've got an illustration in your book, which is one that I've always found interesting, which is in the Spanish Levant, there's lots and lots of rock images of what seem to be violent encounters, and some certainly are violent encounters. But there's one that's in your book of two big sides closing on each other, arrows drawn. But what I find interesting is that between those two sides, standing above them, is one larger figure of a person standing there not engaged in this. And I look at that and I thought, who is that? And I think it's the umpire that, like in Australia, there can be lots of arrows shot without killing anybody. And that is a good way to blow off a lot of the steam. Now, in the modern world in the Emirates, what I've seen is in recent times, from what I've read, there was a conflict that involved Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which got rather intense, but was negotiated to a successful end. And Europe is a good example of transcending the kinds of rivalries that used to exist, which may still exist, but have been transcended by means that keep them closer together. I mean, solving a conflict in a tribal society in the Stone Age is not going to be like solving one in the modern world, but all have their own means of doing so.
I mean, conflict resolution tools, yes, of course, they do exist, and many conflicts have been avoided. But the fact of the matter is that, well, the reality is that there are, I think, over 110 ongoing armed conflicts in the world. And that includes the so-called war against terror. Now, if you look at there's a recent a recent report by the Watson Institute, Brown University, the Costs of War project that they have there. And their estimate is that so it's interesting, right? So they talk about direct deaths and indirect deaths. Direct deaths since the so-called war on terror have been almost 1 million, right? And then the indirect deaths between, I think it's something like between 4 to 5 million.
Right.
And that's ongoing, right? And that has impacted multiple countries around the world. And so, I mean, what is sort of your reaction to that? I'm curious to know, because
I certainly agree with what the...
that's a lot of conflicts that have not been resolved within this
yes.
overarching
And
war, right?
I think one thing with this, though, think of all the ones that have been resolved. Even in the most violent societies on record, ones where maybe it is 10 or 15% of the population getting killed violently. Almost all of their conflicts don't end in violence. If they did, the death rate would go up to 100% within a few weeks. Almost all conflicts do get resolved without violence, even in the most violent societies. And I think what's changed in history is that the range of disputes for which groups consider violence to be a legitimate response has gotten narrower and narrower, particularly the last couple of 100 years. And like when I was a schoolboy, if somebody insulted me in the playground, if I didn't punch him, then the social consequences of failing to punch him were astronomical. But my sister and her husband are both school teachers now, and they say they just get virtually this is in Britain, virtually no schoolyard violence anymore. It's quite extraordinary when kids punch each other at school. And I think this is what we sometimes lose sight of. This is one of the great things that's happened, certainly in my lifetime, this narrowing of the window for what communities will consider acceptable use of violence.
I hear you. And yet in our lifetime, after World War II, we said never again. And yet, and you talked about the rules-based world order that formed, but we see Gaza, we see Sudan, we see Ukraine. I mean, we see these absolutely devastating, horrific wars ongoing. What does that say about human behavior and humanity if we are repeating history over and over again?
Well, I mean, the opinions vary a lot on this. I tend to think that pretty much everybody has something for which they will be willing to use violence. If somebody comes to the door to murder your family, you're probably going to be willing to use violence to prevent that from happening. And there are 8 billion or so people in the world nowadays. It would be quite amazing if we were at a point where nobody anywhere in the world was willing to use horrific violence to solve their problems. So I think just pointing and saying, yeah, there are terrible things out there happening, which obviously is true. Just pointing at those, I don't think really helps us answer this question.
Charlie, you were shaking your head though.
Well, I would just say at the outset, we have to distinguish between at least two kinds of wars, and really there are many kinds of wars. But a very important distinction is interstate wars, wars between two countries, and civil wars, intrastate wars. And sometimes intrastate wars become internationalized. But interstate war, which is probably the worst kind, because this is where, especially when the great powers have gotten into it with each other, nations are just heaving the brunt and brawn of their industrialized societies as one another. And these are devastating wars that kill tens of millions in the past. We don't see those anymore. We haven't seen those in about 80 years. Maybe they're on the uptick and there's more of a risk now. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that was an anomaly from this perspective. We don't know where the trend lines will go. But for a very long time, there were much, much, much fewer of those because, as Ian pointed out, the range of circumstances under which it is now considered legitimate to go to war has narrowed considerably, and it's not to zero. But compared to what the world was like before 1945, when war was just politics by another means, it was the way you enforced international law. There was some scholars at Yale have come up with a data set of war manifestos going back several hundred years, and you could see so many different reasons why nations would go to war. Nowadays, they pretty much have to justify what they're doing in self-defense, or they can't get away with it. And so, of course, that's a bit of an ambiguous term that can be bent and stretched a bit as well. But what I want to say is interstate war may have declined, and that's a good thing. But civil wars didn't. In fact, they increased over this period for a couple of reasons. One was decolonization, but another was that these rule sets didn't really address civil wars. The UN Charter doesn't do anything about that. It establishes rules for the peaceful resolution of disputes between states, but there's no divorce court for states and rebels. And so there's a bit of a gap in the international rules there. It's also a little bit unclear under what circumstances it would be legitimate for a third-party state to intervene in a civil war. There's norms that we shouldn't allow atrocities to go on, but they conflict with other norms that we shouldn't violate territory integrity. So there's some conflicts of rules. But that doesn't change the fact that we've not yet had World War III. And that is a huge boon to humankind, not only because we've avoided that outcome, but because it's enabled us, this period of stability has enabled life expectancy to grow, economies to develop, democracy to flourish, although we're also seeing a setback in that. So it's been a period of greater stability, and I think that it could be chalked up to many factors. But the sea change in how we think about the permissibility of war as a solution after World War II was instrumental in this, in my view.
Do you agree it's been a period of stability and that people
No,
can't get away with
I
war
don't.
anymore unless it's
I mean,
self-defense?
in relative
so I think
terms,
there's a big sort of missing factor here,
Yeah.
which is the racial and socioeconomic aspect of the way that wars are fought around the world. So whereas it may be true that there's been prevention of war in the classical sense in Europe and North America, it is absolutely not the case in most of the world. I'm talking about our region in the Arab world, but also Africa and Asia. I mean, there are so many wars that are happening and that have not been prevented. And so I think this narrative of progress only really applies to quite frankly, the white Western world, which ironically, but perhaps also not ironically, is largely responsible for a lot of the wars that are taking place in the rest of the world. And so that's sort of my initial response to this. And again, I want to go back to what I was trying to say earlier, is that I think it's impossible to extract the act or acts of war from the broader sociopolitical and socioeconomic context within which these wars are fought. This, just because a war has ended doesn't mean it actually has ended, because of the reverberations, which is why I think that it's difficult. I don't see how you can assess the impact or even the trajectory of war without taking into account these millions and millions of so-called indirect deaths of war. Do you see what I'm saying? So this is sort of where I'm at right now.
In response to a lot of things that have been said, the interstate wars, I worked on this back at the time. I was leading a conference during the Rwandan genocide, and they've peaked in around 1992. They still go on, but they've peaked. And if you think about Africa in 1992, there was war in Mozambique, in Angola, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Congo, Rwanda, and more. There are still wars that are going on, and some of them are very intense. But in terms of looking at the ethnic divide, what I found is that these things are not some primordial identification. It's not, there's us and there's them, and there always has been, although it's often portrayed that way by leaders. So in South Sudan today, one of the worst wars that's ongoing involves Nuer and Dinka. And the Nuer and Dinka had wars in the past, but what we see is repeatedly they have sent emissaries between each other to try and find some way to use traditional means of negotiating an end to the conflict. And the political leaders, often the military leaders, sabotage them, often killing them, because they don't want it to end. They're doing just fine the way it is, and either they've got to come out on top as opposed to their opponent, or better, the war goes on. You can probably say the same thing about the rest of Sudan today, too. So these things go on, and they certainly, like in Darfur, they certainly involve identities which are harnessed and brought to bear. The former Yugoslavia was the best example of this back in the 90s. Some other ones, the ethnic identities are so transparently manipulated, like Liberia. After the war's over, people just pretty much forget about it. They're enough to kill for. And in the former Yugoslavia, one of the great quotes was, when a village was split in two, one man was shooting at and being shot at by his neighbors, and he wondered how so quickly he had become nothing but a Serb instead of everything else that was going on. So these identities exist, but looking at, and Rwanda is a great example of this, the Hutu and Tutsi definition is a political category. And there were societies that were vertically structured involving both Hutu and Tutsi. But then they became split in a very artificial way. And the genocide transpired. So looking at these identities, what I would argue is that you need to see them in a diachronic context. You have to see how they become polarized and lead to the violence. And once that happens, it's bubbling passion. They want to kill all of us, whoever the us is. And it's hard to get past that, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to Noha's kind of indictment of Western powers. Arguably, from what I heard from you, is, they created the rules and they've broken the rules, right? And so I was just wondering, how do you square the rules-based order that you mentioned that you still have hope in with what we're seeing today?
Okay, well, I could take that from a number of directions. The first thing I'll just say to your question about the numbers is that it's all relative. It's all relative to what we know about the past and what we know about how bad and deadly wars can be when the great powers are involved in them. It doesn't mean that the world is at peace. And the numbers that I'm citing were also international war numbers. They weren't civil war numbers. So a lot of the wars that you're describing are civil wars. So as far as the rules-based order, though, I think it's a myth that this is a Western rules-based order. In fact, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, these were negotiated by all countries. They are universally ratified treaties. And I think the Global South has had much more of an impact in developing some of the rules that we now think of as sacrosanct and that the West has internalized but initially didn't want. And one of them was the civilian immunity norm. Giovanni Mantilla has written a great book, I don't know if you've read it, about the origins of how we codified that rule. It was codified very, very recently, only in the 1970s. And it was put on the agenda when the Geneva Conventions were updated by the non-aligned movement, by decolonizing countries in the global south. The U.S. didn't want those rules. Britain didn't want those rules. Russia was behind it because it was a good way to shame the West. But now, of course, we never signed that treaty, by the way. But we have incorporated those rules into our military doctrine, and we swear by them. And that's been a very interesting example of norms that were developed and actually imposed on the West by others. I think that the idea that the responsibility to protect doctrine, some of the great champions of that were leaders from the global south, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, Kofi Annan, Francis Deng, also the great Sudanese diplomat and global civil servant. So I think that it's sometimes a myth to think that this is all imposed by the West. However, I also can understand the desire not to treat Europe as the global norm, because it's true that it's not the case. It's also true that historically the laws of war were applied unevenly between nations in Europe versus colonized nations. So that's important to note as well, even if perhaps there's less of that today.
Charlie, about your earlier point of this distinction between interstate wars and civil wars, I was actually not only talking about civil wars, but also I think it's increasingly very difficult to speak of a truly just intrastate war. I mean, let's take Yemen as an example, right? So the most recent sort of conflict in Yemen that erupted with the Houthi takeover of the capital in September 2014. And that was then followed by the military coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and their intervention in March 2015. So legally speaking, that was a non-international armed conflict, but it is one of the most internationalized non-international armed conflicts that we've seen because of the involvement of these external powers, not just in the region, but of course the US and Australia and the UK. I mean, they made billions and billions of dollars off of that war on the backs of, tens of thousands of innocent Yemeni civilians. And so this is why I have a major issue with, this idea that, well, sure, there are some wars happening in certain parts of the world, but they're civil wars, and we've reduced the number of interstate wars, and therefore there's progress. I don't see progress. I see things getting way worse because of the increasing complexities of the ways in which these wars are fought and the complicity of so many people around the world. It's not just the West, of course. I mean, pretty much everyone is complicit in the neighborhood as well.
Yeah, I guess, it seems like we were talking about, I think, three different levels of violence here. And so we're talking about supranational stuff like the United Nations, and these are multinational organizations trying to control the use of violence. And then we've got the modern states, and then we've got the conflicts within the states. And I think one reason why I continue to feel that separating out war as a unique kind of violence is maybe not the best way to go, is the way that these are all connected to each other. Because again, it all comes back to the statistics about which we will doubtless continue to argue indefinitely. But I think most analysts would say certainly over the last couple of 100 years, rates of violent death globally have gone down. Numbers of interstate wars, at least, have generally gone down with the occasional spikes up. And I think this is something we can actually trace back much, much longer than the last couple of 100 years. And the motor that I think has been driving this has been the formation of bigger and bigger governments with more and more power. They're able to kind of scare their own people straight. And I think the people who create governments, these are generally not angels. They are masters of violence, so people take over and create states initially. But what they really want from their subjects is for Charlie and me to go out and farm our farms and pay our taxes every year quietly. They do not want Charlie and me to get into a fight where we burn each other's farmsteads down and kill each other's farm animals and can't pay taxes anymore. So rulers are very, very keen on suppressing violence within their states. But I think the big motor in history of this process has been a kind of paradoxical one, that in order to get strong enough to scare large proportions of your subjects straight, your governments get strong enough that when they direct the violence outward, the wars are more destructive than ever before. And I think this is something we see very clearly just in the last couple of 100 years. That one of the reasons I would say that major interstate wars have declined so much, particularly since 1945, is that the governments are now strong enough that potentially we can end all life on Earth. I think nuclear weapons have been a major part of the decline of major state conflict over the last few centuries, but last few decades. But all of these levels operate together. There was very little attempt to create an interstate level of dispute resolution until we get into very, very recent times. Things all tied together. The world is still a violent place full of terrible things that are going on. All the signs are we should expect things to get worse, not better, in the next few decades. But the long-term overall trend is clearly in the direction, seems to me, in the direction away from using violence to solve our problems. And that's got to be a good thing.
Charlie, Ian mentioned deterrence as a way to preserve peace. Do you agree, or does it trap us into a cycle of fear?
I'd like to address that, but do you mind if I address his
Go
claim
for it.
about states first?
Not at
So
all.
I just want to
Yeah.
say, I just want to agree with you, but also push back in a few ways on this notion that bigger is better and more powerful, more sort of Hobbesian inside makes for a safer international system. I mean, there's a way in which you're right. And I think that anybody who wants to completely defund the police in the US or not have some strong state control over law and order has never lived in a place like Haiti or Somalia, where you just don't have that. And it can be a very dangerous world. But states are not all the same. Totalitarian and authoritarian governments do a lot of harm to their populations. In fact, far more people have died at the hands of their own states throughout history than have died in all wars. And so that's really notable. In the 20th century alone, according to one scholar's estimate, 175 million people were killed at the hands of their own states. And that's enough, to quote R.J. Rummel, he did all this corpse counting. He says, that's enough corpses if you lie them head to toe to circle the earth 4 times. So it's an unimaginable number of dead people. So that's one thing. So what kind of state are we talking about, and where does it end is important. Second, states can also turn, they may bind populations together by pitting them against others, and maybe that keeps things on a low boil, preserves a balance of power, maybe. But states can also turn, when they make war, they can turn their own population, on itself. Peace activists, moderates are often persecuted, minorities, women in interethnic marriages. In the war in Bosnia, they were very much at risk, etc. A terrorist, without due process, anyone can become a terrorist. This is happening in my country again now. And the third thing is, when you start declaring war on crime, when you start sort of cracking down too much on crime domestically, and you look at it broadly, you can end up with wars, as Noha is pointing out, that go on forever, where the ends don't really justify the means, and where a lot of people, the number of people you're killing trying to stamp out crime, transnational crime, terrorism, however you may call it, is wildly disproportionate to the number of people that actually get killed by terrorists. If you look at the statistics on terrorism, certainly before 9/11, 9/11 was like this one big mass casualty event, but only 4,000 civilians died. And I say that having known some of the 9/11 families, but it was a terrible crime and a terrible tragedy. But compare that to a single night of bombing during World War II in Dresden, 40,000 civilians killed in that single night. That was one night of a very long war. So this is a small number in relative terms. More Americans die from heart attacks by eating cheese or by crashing their cars, risks that we are happy to take, than get killed by terrorists. And yet we launched this war. I'm glad you quoted the Costs of War survey. I was going to do so myself. It's killed directly and or indirectly millions of people across Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan during those years. But it's also hasn't solved the problem. It actually increased the incidence of terrorism, because one thing that an overreach of counter-terrorist response does is it breeds more terrorism. So it actually had the opposite effect. It spawned even scarier groups like Daesh, the so-called Islamic State. I put Islamic in scare quotes because, of course, there is nothing Islamic about burning children to death in cages. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would say you can't even do that to insects. But so this was partly the outgrowth of the sectarian conflicts that my government sparked off through this overhanded response to that particular incident. And so I think this question about like what states do and how strong is too strong and where the guardrails lie is very important. And it comes down to, again, questions of definition.
How do we overcome what Noha mentioned, which is all the people who make a lot of money from wars continuing, the military-industrial complex that you kind of referred to? How do we overcome that when money can be such a strong motivating factor?
Well, it's going to be very difficult. And, one thing, and I entirely agree about the human cost, and not just in deaths, of these interstate wars now. And they're not a new thing. It's been talked about in the history of Europe that the formation of modern nation states began with groups that were acting kind of like protection rackets that took over and then institutionalized their superordinate position with tax collectors and scribes and all of that. The wars that are going on now, many of them, they're not building anything. It's often manifestations of what's been called a resource curse. You want to know where there's going to be a war, look at where they've just discovered oil. And they're not building it, they're looting. They're taking everything for themselves. And if there was a reasonable political system there, they wouldn't be able to do that. In terms of the rest of the world, war is huge business. And one of the things that I would add to my initial comment about is war inevitable, that militaries themselves and the militarism that they always encourage, and the United States is a great example of it. Top Gun, for example, the militarism and the armies, and armies all around the world are very powerful actors in any political landscape. And armies are bureaucracies. They're one of the classic form of a bureaucracy. And the institutional imperative is to expand the resources at their disposal. And you do that in part by making any challenge to them somehow unpatriotic and suppress it one way or another. But even if there's a challenge, actually doing something to reverse the development of the military. I mean, many people have commented on how much, the United States, how many resources are devoted to it. And it's just hard to imagine someone who's going to say, we're going to cut down on the amount of support we're giving to the military. And I think that probably is true in most places. So if you're talking about heading towards a warless world, one of the big challenges is how do you do something to counter these militaries?
But actually, on the other hand, I mean, there are occasions when military spending collapses dramatically, like the end of the Cold War. The countries were spending a great deal of money on military defense because there seemed to be this very real possibility of massive conflict breaking out at any minute.
Mm-hmm.
And when the sense of threat diminished, the spending on the military diminished as well. I mean, I can't think there are many governments who actively seek to spend money on the military. Most governments want to cut what they spend on military funding.
Well, I think they want to, but like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I remember headlines such as, how do we spend the peace dividend? And the answer was more war. Spending didn't really go down much. It went down, but it came back up again.
It came back up after 9/11. Came back up after 9/11.
I actually have a statistic here. In 2024, the world spent more money on militaries than ever before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the perception that we're heading to another period of great power conflict is really, really going up.
The perception.
Yeah, the sense that we are heading back into an era of great world wars.
Europe had reduced its military spending. This is what President Trump
Mhm.
always harps on. You've got to spend more of your GDP on the military. But left to their own, they've cut it back. So there are other things to spend it on.
Mhm.
But not, let you get in here.
When you say, Ian, many people are saying we're headed to another era of great power wars.
Mhm.
Again, that's not most of the world. I mean, I would say there are great wars happening in in lots of parts of the world right now, and have been for so long. So that's sort of like my initial response to that. But Charlie, I don't know if I understood what you were saying earlier correctly about, you were saying it's important to consciously think about what type of state we're talking about, and I think you mentioned, that totalitarian or authoritarian states, that's where a lot of the intrastate violence takes place. Is that what you were saying?
Historically,
Okay.
it can.
So the reason that I pick up on this is, in not just in my view, but in the view of many victims, especially the ones that, from places that I've very closely studied, which is the Arab states, would say that democratic countries are extremely violent, and that they are one of the major causes of their violent deaths and their slow violent. That's the other thing we haven't really discussed yet, this very real idea of slow violent death, right? These mass atrocities that take place over decades, again, as a direct sort of impact of war and ongoing war. And so, so I was just curious to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, does it really matter what type of state we're talking about, given that we know that so-called democratic states are not just violent to external, to people in other countries, but to their own people as well? I mean, if we want to talk about the U.S. and what's happening with Black people in the U.S. and other, people of color in the U.S., I mean, that's very violent. Also leads to slow deaths and immediate deaths. So, yeah, I was just curious.
So it depends on how you're counting. Again, it comes back to this question. The numbers I was giving in that one, in my response to Ian, those aren't slow death numbers. Those are actual direct mass murder by government numbers. That happened in the Soviet Union. That happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. That happened in Nazi Germany. That kind of thing has not yet happened in a place like the United States. Now, other kinds of political violence, all have, certainly, especially during the settler period, as we were expanding across, and Native Americans were wiped out, for example.
The 5 million deaths from the cost of war projects, that's 5 million deaths in less than 25
I understand.
years.
But so what I was talking about was what states do to their own populations within their own borders. What you're talking about is what states do outside their borders. So, and you're right, because democracies, there's a pattern that political scientists have found, again, depending how you measure it, that shows that democracies tend not to fight other democracies, but they can be actually more aggressive against those they perceive as non-democracies. So you're absolutely right that it depends. There is some relationship between regime type and the incidence of war. But what I was talking about was the likelihood that a state would actually prey upon its own citizens in a mass way. And I think that the historical record is much worse for totalitarian regimes on that score than for democracies.
But can you isolate it from the totalitarian regimes' alliances with democratic states and the sort of complicity there? Like, for example, again, I'm bringing this back to especially the context of the war on terror, because I think it's a really good example. The counterterrorism policies that have emerged from this war that are then used by authoritarian states around the world to clamp down on their citizens. And then you have the stifling of dissent within those countries, and then sort of using and abusing the counterterrorism narrative to clamp down on this dissent and freedom of expression and so on.
This is such a thoughtful line of argument. I'm not sure if I fully agree. I think that it's possible that the proliferation of mature democracies would actually have that pacifying effect. And it's still the case that that's not necessarily what our foreign policy does. Absolutely, absolutely true. I guess I would also say one other thing, which is that this conversation is very interestingly unpacking this whole distinction we make between domestic and international, interstate war and civil war. And as you rightly point out, wars today are mostly internationalized in ways that make these boundaries a little incoherent. But it's very much a function of how international law is set up. It's the fact that the world is divided up into sovereign territorial states, which Ian has some argument to make that is a system that is more stable than some other systems. But it also creates this sort of myth that there's an inside and an outside. And that myth is part of what also promulgates war when war happens. So it's just very important to remember that these categories, whether we agree they make the world safer or not, they are also just stories we tell ourselves and a function of a political imagination that was codified in international law at a certain point in time. They're not historic. They themselves are not historical inevitabilities.
I'm curious your thoughts on when the spread of democracy has been used as a justification for war. How do you square that with what you're saying in terms of democracy preventing war in many places, and yet hasn't it been used to spread war?
Yes, absolutely. So the argument by political scientists is that mature democracies won't fight other mature democracies, but they will look at a quasi-democracy. Emerging democracy can often be a very unsafe place because until you have those institutions built, there are a lot of opportunities for spoilers to disrupt that process. And democracies can be very opportunistic, and democracies can be very imperious. And that can lead to what we saw after 9/11, George W. Bush's rhetoric, whatever we may think of the actual reasons for these wars. The rhetoric was, we're going to bring democracy to the Middle East. But of course, you don't really do that through war. And we weren't very successful at it at all. That was an example where this democratic peace idea was actually used to foment war. So the truism is not that democracies aren't aggressive. It's just that they don't fight other states they view as more like them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Ian, however grim this may sound, what have we gained from war in terms of innovation? Does it spur that? Does it spur unity?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to make long lists of things that got developed because nations are at war, like microwave ovens, developed out of radar technology. Easy to make long lists of these sorts of things. I think the one thing I would say you might point to as a potential gain from war operates much more at this really, really long-term level, which is we've heard a lot of comments already about how not all states are the same, very much not the same. A place like modern Denmark is not the same as Hitler's Germany, and no way you slice the statistics is going to make it so. And many nations, states and older forms of states have been brutal in exploiting their own people. But the thing that they have done over the really long term is reduce the fighting within these communities. Bind them together in ways that serve the purposes of the rulers, in ways that do reduce the fighting in the very, very long term. And I would say that is the only thing you can really say that's good that's come out of war. And if you were able to design the world from scratch and make it work, I think violence is the last tool you would want to have people use in order to create larger, more coherent communities. And yet the rather depressing thing is this seems to have been the big motor. And on that, one of you mentioned Hobbes earlier. I think it was Charlie mentioned Hobbes earlier. This is the old debate. We could have actually had this debate 300 years ago quite comfortably, because Hobbes had said states drive everything in the 17th century. Rousseau had said states are the cause of all evil and all war in the 18th century. So we could have had exactly the same debate 250 years ago. It's an ongoing argument, but I think at this point the evidence is fairly clear that the a big effect long term of war has been to create these larger states that pacify their internal populations, but then fight even more brutal wars between them. And that is the absolute worst way to get a pacified world. And yet it's the one humanity is constantly turned towards, but less so now than they used to.
So, how would you apply this argument to what's been happening in Gaza, Sudan, Yemen,
Yeah, we've got,
but especially Gaza?
in
yeah.
a sense, it's not that different from so many wars that have happened in the past. Groups of people, governments have decided that violence is the least bad tool to promote what they want. So Hamas decides an attack on Israel is not the worst possible thing they could do. This is the least bad tool to get the end result that they want. The Israeli government has decided that a military attack on Gaza was the least bad tool open to them to get what they want. And now they're arguing over even within the Israeli government and in the Israeli armed
But
forces.
because you
Has
mentioned-
this gone so far now that it's no longer getting us what we want?
Yeah,
It's
but-
actually a negative
But
for us.
because you mentioned the importance of looking at the longue durée, right, when we're assessing
Mhm.
war. And as I'm sure you know, it didn't start with October 7th.
No.
So, given that there is a longue durée of this conflict, or, I don't like calling it a conflict, but you know what I'm talking. So, about this sort of the context of Israel and Palestine, how do you apply that argument that you were making about this progressive trajectory in the longue durée when it comes to Israel and Palestine?
Mhm. Well, the world continues to have wars, and I think, as you say, when you come to try to evaluate them, deciding where you draw the boundaries, where things begin and end, is crucially important. And opinions on what the war is or isn't doing, these tend to change over time. And the First World War is the classic case of this. As while the war has been fought, leaders and a large part of the populations in all the combatant countries think this is a war we have absolutely got to fight and absolutely got to win. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, the first 5 or 10 years, in Britain, France, the United States, there was very little sense that the First World War had been a mistake. For the British in particular, this was the greatest triumph the nation had ever had, with the possible exception of defeating Napoleon 100 years earlier. And it's only in the late 1920s that the public mood began to swing very much against the First World War. And this sense begins to arise that this was a complete waste of life. This is absolutely pointless. But then after the Second World War, a lot of, especially political scientists, start to say, well, we should see World War I in the context of World War II. And it's part of this larger formation of a integrated world market. The leadership has shifted from Britain to the United States by fighting these wars. And the war starts to make sense or not make sense in very, very different sorts of ways. And so the Gaza war, I mean, I don't know what historians will say about this in 100 years' time, but I would bet it's very different from the way it looks to us now.
But how are we defining war today? How has it shifted and changed anyone? Because you're talking about war historically, but there's war and then taking it to another level. We have crimes against humanity, genocide. Like, what level of war is inevitable for us? And what does that say about us as a human civilization?
So, to some extent, these are some of those are legal terms which are defined in international law. So, a crime against humanity is a mass attack of various kinds on a civilian population, but that doesn't necessarily have to happen in time of war. That can also be something that a government like the Soviet Union inflicts upon its own population. Genocide, same thing. It can happen during wars, but it can also happen inside states. And it's similar, except the focus there is the group, the national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And then war, interestingly, is not actually defined in international law. So it's hard. It's one of the paradoxes of the way international law is set up. And what the UN Charter prohibits is the use of military force against the territorial sovereignty, the territorial integrity or political independence of another UN member state. So part of the question in a place like Gaza or Israel-Palestine, but this is not the only such place, is that when in 1945, when the world was carved up into territorial states, and then as it fragmented further after decolonization, lots of groups didn't end up with their own state. They ended up scattered across states or within a state, and so there's quite a lot of contestation, and where you have two groups fighting over the same piece of land, each of them with a claim to be the sovereign entity on that land. Each of them may feel that they are defending themselves, and so then they're making different claims using international law. And it comes back to, I mean, I could talk more about the rules of war, which I think are very important here, actually. But one thing I'll say is that they are meant to be guardrails on conflict, but in certain circumstances, they can actually be confounding when the rules themselves and how to apply them get contested.
I mean, Soraya, just your question about is crimes against humanity, genocide inevitable, or what are we talking about when we say war is inevitable? And I think, so long as there is, and we haven't talked about this yet, but so long as there is dehumanization, then unfortunately, to an extent, such crimes against humanity are going to happen.
But I would say that's not even inevitable in war. And in fact, the Geneva Conventions are designed, they're set up to actually enable combatants to fight limited wars without dehumanizing the other.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is that there is dehumanization. I mean, we do have the laws and everything, but in practice, unfortunately, it's not.
But don't you think something like dehumanization, obviously this goes back as far as we have a literary record of people talking about these things. I mean, don't you think we have seen a movement in the world generally toward pushing back on this? I mean, I think if we'd all lived 1,000 years ago, we would probably not have hesitated to dehumanize all sorts of people. But now, at least maybe I'm wrong on this. I mean, my sense is in more and more of the world talking in ways that dehumanize other people. This is getting more and more difficult. Like the cost of that sort of dehumanization is going up. And obviously it hasn't gone away, nowhere near it. But I don't know, I just have this sense that it is less of an issue now than it used to be.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm of two minds with this. I think that there is growing solidarity in the face of dehumanization. But I think that the costs of dehumanization are definitely still there and still vast.
Brian?
I'd just add a little that in war, you always have to draw a line between us and them, or else you wouldn't know who to kill. Well, what distinguishes murder or homicide from the valorous conduct of killing in war. In human history, dehumanization hasn't been the only way to do it. Although it may sound bizarre to us, accusations of witchcraft have probably been more of a motivation to kill others. It's not dehumanizing them. There's other things like violations of kinship requirements. Makes no sense to us at all, but it could be cause for war against them. Dehumanization is something that is part of modern society in some ways, and older societies too. Certainly China saw everyone outside of China as barbarians that were hardly at the level of people, and so whatever you did to them was justified. But there's always going to be some negative connotation, some negative characterization of the other. War exists on a continuum. And what you've said many times, that even after the peace treaty is signed or the armies go back to their barracks, killing continues. Mozambique is a great example of this. People haven't had peace in Mozambique since independence. Even though the wars have stopped, the killing goes on. So this definition of the period, now we're at war, does that mean we're at peace? And a lot of peace researchers would say this is what they call the negative concept of war. It's only when a war is declared A positive concept of war and peace is that you have to have a reduction or elimination of things like structural violence, which is what you're talking about, and that focusing on the period between the declaration, or even if it's not the first attack, when most people would, in retrospect, say that's when the war began and that's when it ended, doesn't encompass the reality on the ground.
Do you accept what Ian said, that however depressing, war has been necessary for innovation throughout
Has
history?
been necessary for what?
For innovation?
No, I don't think so.
No, and actually, I wouldn't say that
Yeah.
either.
Well,
you were
It spurs certain kinds of innovation. And some economists have looked at the history of recent wars and totaled up all the sort of the net value of the innovations that come out of the technical work during the wars and said, look, wow, isn't this great? War caused all these really good things. Other economists come along and say, well, innovation is a market driven largely by investment and capital. So all the money that gets poured into microwave ovens because of the invention of radar, that's money that didn't get spent on something else. And some of the best people doing this work, I think, make a pretty compelling case that on the whole, war is a brutal distortion of markets for innovation. And it's going to give you fabulous innovations in jet engines and a lot of other things that are great for certain things. But the broader range of things we might be researching and innovating in, that doesn't happen. So, yeah, so I wouldn't say that war is, well, I say war is a spur for certain kinds of innovation, not always the ones we want.
But what about civilizational growth, the necessity of war for that? Because if I'm interpreting correctly, you were saying that it does lead to civilizational growth on the long term, and that
Yeah.
we'll be looking at today's wars very differently in 100 years.
Yeah, I think what I think most of the historians have looked at this will tend to say that one of the biggest things driving the construction of more coherent and complex states, including things like the development of welfare states, has not been fighting wars, it's been preparing for wars and building an economy that's going to be capable of fighting a war if it has to, doing things that will bind a community of citizens together. And they'll often talk about the sort of the implicit deal in warfare, that the government says to you, if there comes a war, we're going to conscript you and we're going to jack taxes up, 95% marginal tax rates, take all this stuff away from you. In return, we're going to make being a citizen of this state a really good thing. We're going to have a national health service. We're going to have all these other things. And this implicit deal is made. And a lot of historians think that it was the success of Western democracies in creating this deal with their own citizens that gave them the edge over the Germans in both of the world wars. So these deals get made. States become bigger and bigger, more and more complex, able to do more and more things. But there's this one historian, political scientist, guy named Paul Kennedy, who had this great line about what makes a state into a great power is the ability to fight a great war. What stops a state being a great power is fighting a great war. It's like the preparation has all these positive externalities. Actually fighting the war is catastrophic.
Charlie, do you agree?
I think I agree and disagree with some of that. I
Well,
mean,
that's pretty good,
on
I
this
think. That's
on
all I
this
asked for.
question of, it sounds like you're asking, is there some benefit to war? And I think I would agree with something Noha said at the beginning, which is that in certain situations, war might be necessary as a last resort. If you look at the UN Charter, it's really based on just war theory, which implies that you want to limit war, but certain wars are justified. Wars of self-defense, wars to defend others, to punish an aggressor, or perhaps to defend vulnerable citizens, but they should only be fought under very limited circumstances, and it's a very small subset. And when they are fought, they should be fought only according to certain rules that limit the harm to non-combatants, etc. So I'm not coming at this as a pacifist, but I will say that I think in empirical terms, the international community has mostly turned away again, in relative terms, compared to what the rules, norms, and expectations and practices were, say, 200 years ago and going further back. Now we don't think of prestige as coming from fighting a war. It comes from economic progress. It comes from sending rockets to the moon, or putting on a good Olympics, or managing a pandemic well. And I think that you can find one of the best arguments that I've heard about the social value of war is just that it binds people together. And there are some studies of veterans and even civilians that have lived through war that talk about how they kind of miss those days where the community had something to focus their attention and regular life feels empty by comparison. But that does not have to be war. And when you talk about the costs versus the benefits of war, especially when you're tallying up the real cost, not just battle deaths. I mean, until very recently, we didn't even measure the civilian direct deaths of war, much less the indirect ones. When you look at the wider costs of war, environmental degradation, psychosocial harm, malnutrition and stunting due to deprivation, etc. And then you compare it to sort of these psychosocial benefits. It's really a silly balance sheet in some ways. You can create that kind of solidarity through other kinds of collective projects for the global public good. So I think of COVID. You guys remember when that pandemic first hit. But in the US, everything ground to a halt pretty quickly. And citizens did what the government told us to do. We went in our houses.
I think it depends where you lived in the US, actually.
It didn't last forever, but there was this moment where people turned on a dime and stopped moving around. And it wasn't easy. It felt like a sacrifice to some. Some people could do it more easily than others. And there were downsides, but the smog cleared. And I think it comes back to your point about what government is for. And it is for solving collective problems, providing public goods. Imagine if we asked citizens to sacrifice the way we did during a good war, World War II, and the way we did during the early days of the pandemic for the common good, to ration goods, to turn down the air conditioning in our freezing malls. Imagine if we had the military fighting wildfires and rescuing people from floods, or building completely new kinds of cities in the global north so that it would be possible to welcome climate refugees, instead of tackling, trumped up crime or defending borders. There are global problems that can be solved with a concerted approach by states in concert with international organizations, but we would need to build political will for that, and that would take different kinds of stories, different kinds of agendas. And it's true that citizens look to states to sort of lay that agenda for them and tell them what to do. Markets aren't going to naturally solve those problems. So that's one of the central conundrums of our time.
We are getting better at this. I mean, there's this sense of community building activities that are not about killing other people. It's like getting about Britain, where I grew up. If there's one thing the British people care about, it's the National Health Service. When I was a little boy, it was like everybody in my parents' generation had frozen in 1940, 20 years before I was born, during the Battle of Britain. They never moved on from the Battle of Britain. It was the defining thing in their lives. Nowadays, when they're having elections, political campaigns in Britain, it's not Britain as a world power that's a thing that galvanizes the votes. It's what are you going to do for the National Health Service? I mean, I do feel that we are getting better at non-military nation-building activities.
Well, who is we? Are you talking about Brits? Are you talking about states in general? Are you talking about the global community?
I don't know why I think you can quantify this, but I would say on average around the world. But clearly, yes, you're absolutely right. It's some countries more than others. Definitely.
I would go back to just the question you asked me about innovation. And that's an idea that's out there. Robert Ardrey, to go back in time, said that if you're against war, look at everything that we have today, from freedom to not just weapons, to religion, to everything. It goes back to war. War is the prime mover in innovation, which is bunk. I think one of the things that the Cost of War Project has shown is how much has been, one of the costs is the diversion of investment in the United States towards the military and away from other things where it could go. And this is, the military likes to say, well, the military, there is no the military. But many people have said, look at all the things that have come out of investment in the military. But it's, one of my teachers wrote a book in the 1960s, Seymour Melman, called The Permanent War Economy. And he was an industrial economist, and he just showed what was not done in the United States from all the stuff they put into the military, including things that are totally useless, like the entire nuclear arms race and the all of the extreme amount of resources that went into finding a way to shield electronics from an electromagnetic pulse. Not something we think about today, but huge amounts of money went into this. So I think war is a drag on innovation, and it's certainly a drag on social progress. And I think we're going to be seeing that in the United States now with cuts to things like Medicaid, Medicare, and partly because we're not going to cut back on the military. We're going to increase the military. Well, also cutting taxes for the rich. But war, I do not think, is some things, yes, but not a real source of innovation in economies or societies.
Noha, are things getting better, like Ian said,
Yeah.
or is war just becoming more impersonal and people are becoming more detached to what is actually happening on the ground?
Well, to that point, I mean, yeah, I think that especially for Western militaries, those societies are becoming more and more detached, and even the militaries themselves are becoming more and more detached because of the use of drones and these are sort of remote weapons, and so there is, I think, for sure, there's a sense of detachment there. Now, I'm glad you raised the beginning of the question, which is because I also want to pick up on this, Ian, this exchange between you and Charlie, when you said, aren't we getting better at this? The National Health Service in the UK. And then Charlie said, who's we? And then you said, okay, well, some more than others. So then I want to take that for who are the some? Who are the some
I
that
think
we're
it
talking
depends
about?
specifically what it is you're talking about, because there's so many things that we've seen global benefits in, like, say, GDP per capita, the amount of wealth people have. Globally, real wages have tripled from 100 years ago. Globally, lifespans have increased by 30 years from 100 years ago. Globally, nutrition has improved so much that on average, humans everywhere are 10 centimeters taller than they used to be. There are certain things where there is just no way to deny there have been global scale improvements. And yet at the same time, of course, the benefits have flowed more to certain parts of the world than to others. So I think you've got to get down to specifics.
And you're saying those improvements are a result of war?
I think they are a result, above all, of the creation of the multilateral organizations that came out of the Second World War. So it is, in a sense, the result of war. And some of them go back well before that, like, say, things like improvements in nutrition, driven very much by the spread of the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels around the world. But it's particularly, I think, the creation of these multilateral organizations since 1945 that has driven global improvements in health, in safety, and all kinds of things, which I think is what, for me, is what makes it so worrying about the trend over the last 5 or 10 years toward backing away from multilateral organizations, toward reducing the world to bilateral relationships where the strong dominate the weak, because I think that's the way the world is currently going.
But when you talk about, improvements in health and safety, I mean, again, I'm sorry for insisting on this. Could you sit with the tens of thousands of Yemenis and the Sudanese and the Syrians and the Palestinians right now and say, oh, but there's been so much progress in the world. And you know what? We're going to look back at this war that you're caught up in 100 years from now and say it was worth it because it made the world a better place. But also, and again, I mean, I think I want to pick apart this narrative of progress that I feel that keeps coming up here. I mean, the UK is maybe great with the National Health Service, but it's also really great at continuing to sell billions of dollars or pounds of weapons to Israel and other states to kill innocent civilians. The UK has also done a really fantastic job of continuing to colonize the Chagos archipelago, despite the ICJ ruling, which is a multilateral entity, the highest judicial authority, and the UK has continued to ignore that ruling about Chagos. So, in my mind, I mean, you were saying it's relative, Charlie, but so we need to talk about the relativity here.
Yeah, and I think Charlie was absolutely right to say that. Yeah, the UK is doing all kinds of wicked things, as all governments do, but compared to the level of British wickedness in the 19th century, things have gotten a lot better. And you say we're colonizing the Chagos Islands. We were colonizing, what was it, a third of the surface of the planet in the 19th and early 20th
Okay,
centuries.
so what about the legacy of colonialism that persists?
I'm sorry, the legacy
of colonialism.
of colonial. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously it has a legacy. How could something like that not?
Right, but that legacy has very real consequences for the health, safety, equality, racial justice of millions.
Very true. And
Right.
yet lifespans have increased across the globe. Health has improved in most former colonial countries.
I feel like you're deflecting here because I'm talking about the legacy of the colonial wars, right? We're talking about war, right? And colonization is a form of war. And lifespans may have increased, but that's irrelevant to what I'm trying to say here. So I'm very genuinely interested to hear your views on this progress narrative, despite the legacy of colonialism, the ongoing legacy of colonialism, and really the persistent refusal of not just the UK, but other colonial powers to, for example, provide reparations to help put an end to the persistent inequalities that we see in the Caribbean countries, for example. So this is sort of where I'm at right now, what I'm trying to get at. I'm curious to know, how does this fit into your narrative of progress?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you should not let the best be the enemy of the good. I mean, the world is not a perfect place. That doesn't mean that it's not improving.
But don't you think that's a very privileged stance to take? You're
Well, not
speaking
really.
from
I mean,
a place of
if
privilege
I
when
had
you say
grown up
that?
as a peasant in one of the western parts of China, now there's a pretty good chance I would live 30 or 40 years longer than my parents' generation had. I think all across the world, for many, many people, the world has become a better place. And obviously that is fat consolation to somebody living in Gaza or South Sudan. But it doesn't change the reality of the larger picture, the fact that smaller parts of the picture are absolutely terrible.
How do you explain this restlessness then that you kind of described earlier about the perception that things are getting worse?
So the restlessness. What do you
Yeah, I
mean
mean,
there?
you kind of mentioned there's a sense of people feeling that, countries are arming themselves to the
Oh,
teeth
I see.
again.
Right.
And, there is global instability, even in your own country. I mean, I don't know a lot of Brits that would agree that the NHS is getting better, for instance, right?
Mhm.
So how do you square that with what you said earlier, which is that things are getting better?
Yeah, I think the biggest driver for peace since 1945 was the creation of this very stable Cold War relationship, which it sounds a very peculiar thing to say, but this very stable Cold War relationship between the United States and its partners and the Soviet Union. And one thing that nuclear strategists like to say is that during the Cold War, the world was terrifying but simple. You had these two great powers facing off with more than enough nuclear weapons probably to kill all life on the planet. But the rules evolved over time, and the leaders in both countries, they kind of knew what they could and couldn't do. And the chances, other than by an extreme series of accidents, the chances of there actually being a nuclear war were pretty low. Now we live in a world that is less dangerous because we've still, I mean, after the great getting rid of nuclear warheads after 1989, I think we've still got something like 10, 15% of what we had at the peak in 1986, when over 70,000 warheads. So we almost certainly don't have enough weapons to kill everybody on the planet in one day, which has got to be good. So it's become less dangerous, but it's become more complicated. We now have multiple states out there with nuclear weapons. I think you've got to be ridiculously optimistic to think we're not going to see rapid nuclear proliferation over the next 20 years. The world is becoming more complicated. We are getting into situations where countries are going to have nuclear weapons and might not consider their use to be the absolute last resort. And that is the kind of thing I was thinking about, this perception, particularly in strategy circles, that the odds of major interstate wars breaking out is going up and up. And activities that would have seemed absolutely unthinkable 20, 30 years ago, like the Russians just annexing Crimea, like the Russians invading Ukraine again in 2022, this sort of thing is no longer seeming unthinkable. And Chinese leadership is much less cautious than they used to be about talking about a military solution to the Taiwan issue. And a lot of them, including people right around Xi Jinping, are talking about 2027 is the cutoff date. That is the point at which if Taiwan hasn't come back to China peacefully, it will come back forcefully. And so this is what I meant when I said people are increasingly anxious that in the short term, at least, the world is going in a truly terrifying direction.
I'm just going to say there are definitely enough nuclear weapons still in the world's arsenals to create catastrophic climate effects, mass starvation,
absolutely,
and a global Holocaust if there were an exchange.
We could have
significantly.
World War II casualties in one day, no doubt about that. But could we kill everybody? Probably not.
Well, it wouldn't all happen in one day. It would partly happen from famine that would result after.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I take your point, which is that your backward-looking statement about global history goes way back. But it's not necessarily a prediction about what will happen in the future. Yeah. And it's true that some of the guardrails that I've been talking about that were set up in the 20th century and the 19th century with the Geneva Conventions are to some extent perceived to be at risk. Perhaps they are at risk, especially with the U.S. retreating from some of its support and funding for some of these institutions in this moment, and other great powers, Russia and China, reinterpreting the rules or trying to rewrite them to their liking. Perhaps this rules-based order is crumbling, perhaps. And if it is, if I'm right, and those rules and not the existence of nuclear weapons is what is partly behind this relative period of peace, then perhaps we are mathematically at risk of having more wars in the future. It's a little bit hard to know. There's certainly a lot of fear. But I would say, and coming back to your point, because you're asking a really good question, but I'm sort of in the middle between you and Ian on this, because on the one hand, I'm very much in favor of finding ways to measure all of these effects that often didn't always get measured in the past when we were thinking about what it meant to code a war or code the costs of war. But at the same time, I think the fact that there's a long way still to go to get to the ideal, that fact can exist, and that moral judgment can exist with acknowledgement of the empirical fact that some things have changed for the better. And so I think it's hard to imagine what it was like in the 19th century when you had these big pitched battles in fields. People were so inured to this that they would bring out picnic blankets and watch the battle with their kids. That was kind of like entertainment for them. And then afterwards, there wasn't yet a norm that you even took care of the soldiers afterwards. They were mostly left to just rot in the sun or die of their wounds when the rest of the cavalry would move on. And we don't have that anymore. We don't see that anymore. Sometimes tens of thousands of soldiers would die in one day, in one weekend, in one of these battles. We don't see that anymore. And we don't see it because someone came along and changed the story and convinced people, the princes and states of that time, the Ottoman Empire as well, to create the Geneva Conventions. This was just a Swiss businessman who came by one of these battles and decided instead of passing by, he was going to roll up his sleeves, and help the local women care for the soldiers. But it wasn't that he did that. It was that he wrote a memoir about it and sent it around to all of the political elites of the day and got them together and said, we can do better. We can establish some fundamental rules just to take care of the wounded soldiers after. And that sort of set the ball rolling on this multilateral codification of the rules on how you conduct a war. We haven't talked as much about those. We've talked about the rules abolishing war, but not the rules on how we conduct. We still have terrible war crimes. We see them today. There are still genocides that are happening today. But the levels, the casualties, the rate of casualties, and the kinds of wars that are being fought look very different and have lower body counts. And that doesn't invalidate the horrors that we still see. What I'm pointing out is that we are much more we are much less desensitized now to those. We want to stop them. We've built institutions to punish those crimes. People are putting pressure on their political leaders to do something, and that wasn't happening in those days. So I think that is progress, even though we still have a very long way to go. Do you disagree? What do you think?
I'm just not. I mean, I don't know where these statistics are coming from about, fewer deaths. And I mean, I appreciate that you do acknowledge that there are horrors that continue, and they don't just continue. I mean, in my mind, I think that it's getting worse and worse. So, I mean, I would love to know the statistics that you guys are referring to. But I want to sort of focus on this idea of the longue durée again, because I think that's a very key, it seems that that's a very key component of your argument, Ian. And again, I mean, if we were sitting here today at this table with a 40, 45-year-old Iraqi who was 5, 7 years old during the 1990s, if my math is correct, during the horrific US and UK-led economic sanctions against Iraq, which were facilitated by the UN. So, I mean, we're talking about institutions; they're not entirely innocent, right? And so, you have these horrific economic sanctions against Iraq, essentially punishing an entire population for the actions of Saddam Hussein, endemic malnourishment, total destruction of basic infrastructure, health services, education, when before the sanctions, Iraq had one of the strongest ones in the region. And then you get to 2003 and the illegal invasion, US-UK invasion of Iraq. So if we're sitting here today, and then of course the aftermath of that 2003 invasion, which didn't go very well, right, to say the least. And Afghanistan is also a comparable example. But if we had this Iraqi person here with us today, and you made this longue durée argument, what do you think this Iraqi person would say about their experience of the longue durée? Or is their lifespan not long enough for you to make the argument that there's been progress? Do you see what I'm saying? I'd just be curious to really be a fly on the wall and see you in conversation with, and of course this is just, I'm talking about an individual, but really it's representative of millions, not tens of thousands, millions of people who've been affected by, these violent actions that have been taking place for many, many decades.
Yeah, I very much doubt that the Iraqi would be too impressed by long-term arguments. And I think this would be the same if we brought here someone, say, who'd lived in Poland in the 1930s and 40s. You could not expect a Polish person to be impressed by an argument. But hey, look how it's going to look by the 2020s. Poland is going to be so fabulous compared to what it was like when you grew up. And for that, you can hardly fault the Iraqi or the Pole for feeling, yeah, well, big deal. That isn't of benefit to me. But I mean, don't you think that just that the whole world is like this? And there are things that happen that may be very good things for many, many people in the long run, but for us personally are tragic. I mean, I get this feeling you're making sort of utopian arguments and saying, I can imagine a utopia in which these things don't happen. And therefore, there is no room to say that things are getting better.
I'm not saying, no, I'm not making a utopian argument, especially, I mean, I started off by saying war is inevitable, right? We started off this conversation by saying that. But I think that, and again, when you make these arguments that, well, in 100 years, again, you're saying this from a position of privilege because you can afford to say that. You can sort of, I mean, what hope does that kind of argument give to anyone about progress in their lifetime? Do you see what I'm saying? This is what I'm sort of uncomfortable with because I don't understand it.
Yeah, and I think maybe you're expecting goods to be evenly distributed. The world has never been that way and never will be that way. There are things that happen that are generally speaking good for the world, and yet some people will suffer terribly from them.
So, and some
I can imagine
is,
a world
and
where goods
again,
are more evenly
but who is the
distributed.
sum? Who is the sum? And I think it is perfectly reasonable to want all basic goods to be distributed equally. Maybe it's naive, but it's not an outlandish expectation. And so again, this sum that you keep referring to, this is what I like. What is it exactly? Who are the sum that we're talking about?
Well, I think that there's some who tend to get the short end of the stick are the ones who are unlucky enough to live in the parts of the world where there are major geopolitical conflicts.
What
over them.
parts? What are those parts that you're
It
referring
moves
to?
around depending on what the great power conflicts are. So, I mean, for a long time, the Middle East was not a particularly violent part of the world. It became so much more recently. For a long time, Europe was the most violent part of the world, where the war deaths was so much higher, the concentration camps so much more brutal. Now it isn't. And I think it depends on what the great
So, but
conflicts
let's
are.
say, okay, over the past 100 years,
Mhm.
who are the sum that you're
So 100
referring to?
years ago, we were back in the 1920s. So I guess at that point, probably China would be one of the least desirable places to live. I mean, the sweeping judgment there. But I mean, many civil wars raging in China. By the time you get into the late 1930s, Europe becomes the center point of global misery through the early part of the 1940s, even into the late 1940s. And then the conflict shift around the world. Southeast Asia becomes a
So they shift, but then how do you reconcile that with your narrative of progress? So if there's progress and it's a continuum of progress,
There can be-
who is it progress for? If
there can be
the lack of
progress.
progress is affecting everyone,
There can be progress
over
without
time.
it being consistent and constant everywhere. I think we have variations around a trend line,
He's
which I
look-
think is what we see.
He's looking at global statistics, I think. But what I hear you saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, let me know if I am, is that on the one hand, someone like me, I'm coming at it from the perspective that I'm optimistic that the great powers have managed to tiptoe around each other in their conflicts without fighting another very, very bloody world war in 80 years. I see that as a sign of progress. But what you're saying is, depends how you look at it, because this particular great power piece froze in place a lot of situations that have then had a slow churn of violence that may not look as bad, but over time it adds up almost to be worse, and we can't get out of them. Am I sort of hearing you correctly that it's sort of which piece of the pie we're starting from really shades what we see as progress and how we measure that progress?
Brian,
Yeah.
should we aspire to something greater? Yes, we've talked about violence being part of our history from the beginning of time, essentially. But is there a shift now in terms of how much that violence is being documented, how much the awareness is spreading? For instance, global solidarity movements to end the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. Should we aspire to something greater? I mean, you tried to kind of, Charlie, reimagine ways that countries could leverage maybe soft power initiatives or collective projects or collective experiences like COVID. You know, are we at a point we can aspire to that, or are we
Well, yes,
doomed to
I
keep
think
repeating the
that
same mistakes?
if people don't aspire to that, and that's one of the reasons I've worked to counter the idea that it's somehow in our genes. If people don't aspire to that, I don't think progress will be made because I think that people do see war as, even people who make war, most of them see war as an evil thing. And what I've tried to do is say, like, what's one message that I can take out of my work for people who are concerned about war to bring to their consciousness, and that is, I sum it up as with the phrase, leaders favor war because war favors leaders. Now, not all leaders favor war, and war doesn't always favor all leaders. But generally speaking, the position of leaders gets stronger when there is foreign conflict. But this goes back through time into tribal societies. And we see even in very egalitarian societies, if you're trying to understand why particular wars happen, look at the interests of the leaders, the Yanomami, who I've written about. We have some great inside information from a young woman who was captured by Yanomami from her family. And she's married to, as a adult, married to a man who seems hell-bent on starting a war. And she's talking, she's given recordings of her life history. She's talking to the two other wives, and why is he doing this? Why is he provoking a war? And one of them says, maybe he wants to go back to being the chief of all of us, because if there's war, he'll be the leader of it. So in dealing with wars, and I've written this especially about the kinds of intra-state identity-linked wars, is the leaders create a narrative in which there's an us and there's them. And while they make it seem like it's a timeless thing, it's very often very recently constructed. And they threaten us. They're going to kill us. They're going to take our women. They're going to do whatever. But we have to defend ourselves against them. Again and again, you see this, sometimes in outrageous, how can anybody believe this ways? But that happens. And in other societies, it's not so outrageous. It's made more cautiously. But I think that what people who want to learn something about why wars happen is when leaders talk to you and say, this is why we have to go to war, the moral imperative they cite, question it. Before the Iraq War, I was at a conference and I talked about the theory that leaders will always come up with the highest applicable moral values for their own society to justify what they're doing in war, which is very often just something that really reinforces their own interests. And at this conference was a very well-placed reporter who said that it was funny because he had been in the halls of power in Washington when the invasion had already been decided in Iraq. And they were talking about how they needed to, the phrase they used was moral it up. They had to moral it up. And so what it became about is the rights of women. That's which we didn't give a damn about before. But that's why we're going to go into Iraq. That's why we're going into Afghanistan. And they may come to believe it themselves. But I think that having people aspire to less war, if not no war, but less war, involves more critical scrutiny of the interests of the leaders who are advocating war. And I think that certainly applies today. So aspiration against war is necessary. And one way to act on that is just be more critical and help expose the actual interests in advocating war at any given time.
Noha, I'm wondering if AI now, is it accelerating war and violence, or can it be part of the solution in trying to limit war, as Brian put it?
I mean, this is a really important question that is, I mean, it's talked, I feel like it's talked about a lot, but it's not, it's still understudied. So I'm not an expert on this, but when this topic of AI and militaries and wars comes up, what I sort of immediately think of is the challenge of identifying who is the perpetrator when something goes wrong, right? Is it the machine that made the decision that should be held accountable, or is it the human being behind the machine? So that's sort of, that's what I think of when this issue of AI and autonomous weapons and stuff comes up. But other than that,
Actually, I'm no expert on AI and war either, but I don't think there are any experts. I think this is what is so alarming about this. Nobody knows what this is going to mean in the short run. There's a strong sense that almost everything that militaries have been doing in the recent past is going to be turned on its head. Intensely destabilizing period that we're living through. And again, I don't know how many of you talk to military people, but the one thing they are all scared about is destabilization. The one thing they want rules, they want norms, they want to be able to interpret the activities of other actors. They want to be confident that when I tell somebody to do X, the results will be Y and Z, and not some sort of scrambled thing I can't even imagine. And AI is scrambling everything. So again, I didn't mention this earlier, but when you were asking me about, well, why is it you think there is this rising sense in strategic circles that we might be moving back to a world of great power conflict? AI is one of the things that might potentially drive this. And particularly, I've heard a number of people talk about if one group of politicians decides that their country has a temporary edge in AI, they might decide this is the time to use it. So I think the one thing we can say is this is super destabilizing, terrifying development.
When in 2007, I was working on my book Lost Causes, and it was a book about why some issues get on the international agenda and others don't. And I was at that time interviewing a lot of roboticists and ethicists who were the early norm entrepreneurs that we should have a treaty banning the use of killer robots or autonomous weapons. The idea was you don't want machines making targeting decisions by themselves without a human in the loop. And eventually this campaign took off. You've probably heard about it now. What has happened, which is even more alarming, however, is it's not the issue of humans being taken out of the loop and letting AI do all the thinking for us. It's humans staying in the loop, but delegating our own intelligence to the algorithm. So in Israel, you guys may have read about this. I think it was last year. It was leaked to the media by some IDF intelligence officers, to their great credit, that Israel had developed a data curation algorithm that was now generating kill lists based on certain characteristics, not based on law of war criteria. And the human weaponeers were now being ordered that their only role was to spend 20 seconds per name and mostly make sure these were men and not women, which is not a way to actually implement obligations under the Geneva Conventions, because civilian men are also protected from attack. And this algorithm was also doing things like encouraging bombs to be dropped in people's homes instead of out on the street, which would be more discriminate, etc. But the weaponeers were not being given time to make the human judgments that they needed to make. That is their responsibility under humanitarian law. It's almost like you took the human out of humanitarian law, but kept their finger on the trigger. I think this is the most distressing thing about AI. It's not just limited to war. I see it in myself when I think my ability to read a map without GPS has been compromised after so many years. My students can barely write an essay without ChatGPT. So this is why I don't allow them. I'm back to writing exams in the classroom, because I want them to think about what we lose if we outsource too much to algorithms, and it's no different in war.
And I jump in that to go back to an earlier iteration of the technological fix, the email and the internet, when there was a very common idea before the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia that one of the reasons why wars happen is people can't communicate with each other. Now they'll be able to. And I witnessed this, and it was quite shocking to see that people being from opposite sides being able to communicate with each other only hardened attitudes. It didn't lead to people giving up on their positions. It led to them reinforcing their positions. The AI is going to, from what we can see, whether through hallucination or just the fact that continual interaction with like ChatGPTs, that the AI will come to your point of view and provide you things that support it, will give you information that you want to get. So, and sometimes it's a complete hallucination. And apparently these hallucinations cannot be fixed. It's what I understand about it. So you can think, well, my AI machine is telling me that I'm right about what bastards those people are. And I'm right when I say we got to do something about it before they come and get us. I don't think it's going to provide some kind of dispassionate rationality. And the algorithms that can be fed into it by the makers or owners of a AI engine will can put in algorithms to favor or disfavor different kinds of answers, or it could be hacked. And those can go in. So I think that AI is going to give a veneer of I'm just being rational when it's helping you reinforce your own prejudices and allowing an opening for others to deliberately get in there and manipulate it in ways to reinforce prejudices in a way they want to manipulate it. So I have no hope for AI and doing something positive in this particular area.
So does anyone have any hope for AI
I think
helping
it's impossible to know at this point where this is going to go. Because in one sense, AI in war, it's just an extension of a trend that goes back well over a century of the increasing handing over of war fighting to the machines that we've created. And so like in the Battle of Britain in 1940, the British used radar. Radar basically tells the British where to go to intercept German bombers, which would not have been possible without radar. Nowadays, a fighter pilot does rather little actual flying of the plane. It's all handled by the machine. I guess the most famous case of the machines gone mad was 1983, when the Soviet early warning system detects an incoming American nuclear attack. And it all came down to the decision of a single engineer not to forward this report up the command chain to the Kremlin, for which he was rewarded by being demoted and sent off to a post where he wouldn't be in charge of anything anymore. So the potential for our machines to destroy us all has been around for quite a while now. But with AI, we just don't know. I think this really is a different order of complexity and challenge. Everything is happening so fast now. I mean, you talk about humans being moved sort of from in the loop to on the loop to out of the loop altogether. And this has already gone past the point where it could conceivably be reversed. But we have no idea where it's going to stop.
And just to refer to your work about global networks being hierarchical, there was an idea when these were developing that it's going to be more horizontal, more egalitarian. Didn't turn out to be true. What happened was the people with power found ways to reinforce their power through the networks. And I don't see any reason to think this will be any different at all, as just another tool of control.
He brings up an interesting point. Is a multipolar world more likely to go to war?
Well, that depends on who you ask, and it depends on what you mean by multipolarity. If you're talking about states, then there is an argument to be made that depending on what the distribution of power is, it is a more destabilized world, because in a unipolar world you have a hegemon and people, or even in a bipolar world you will have smaller states bandwagoning and you can achieve a greater balance, more actors involved, more complexity. I think of multipolarity in a different way, though, which is I think about the state system, but I also think about the global civil society layer. And our world is not just a world of poles amongst states. It's a networked world. It's a world in which individuals have far more power and far more media power than they ever did. It's a world in which coalitions of global south actors, middle power states, and NGOs have access to UN conferences, the ability to throw their own conferences, build norms without the great powers if necessary. And some of the best innovations in international law have happened that way, sort of despite what great powers wanted. And those norms, once you build them, actually do bind and affect the great powers as well. I've done the research lab I run at UMass, I've done some opinion polling on attitudes about the lawfulness of nuclear weapons, and am finding even in nuclear states that have not signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, 83% of both civilians and military now believe these weapons could never be used lawfully. And that's important, especially for the military, because they are required to disobey orders they consider to be unlawful. And one of the things that drives that, our experiments show, is whether they have information or have ever heard of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Well, none of the nuclear states have signed that treaty. They're not actually bound by it. But the power of these norms that have been built by the rest of the world is actually affecting the attitudes of the Stanislav Petrovs. I like that you began your book with this story of this Soviet missileer who disobeyed 2 nuclear launch orders during the 1980s that would have ended in nuclear Armageddon. That's a war that didn't happen, that you never know about, because you don't know about the things that that don't happen. But I think that these norms do have power, and I'm somewhat optimistic, even when I see the great powers pulling out of some of these institutions and norms or just behaving badly, that I don't think the rules-based international system is actually entirely, it doesn't exist just at the leisure of these great powers. Other actors have a say as well. And so in that sense, I think a world where there are more access points, more voices, can be a more stabilized world and a more hopeful world.
I hope you're right. I must say that the historical record doesn't lend great optimism on this front. I mean, the great periods of peace have tended to be when you've got great empires, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Han Dynasty, China. But of course, the peace that they bring comes at a price. It's a peace of subjection to an imperial power. And when you see the fragmentation of those empires, you overwhelmingly see an increase in the use of violence to solve problems. Whether that's still the case, I think this is the big challenge for the kind of work I do, looking at long-term historical patterns and asking what they can tell us about the future. One of the big things you learn is, of course, things are changing all the time. The fact that you've got a trend that lasted for thousands of years doesn't necessarily mean it's going to carry on lasting. And as you say, I mean, what you're talking about, the idea of sort of global commons and individuals having tremendous kinds of power and connection they didn't used to have. They didn't used to have them. And so maybe these historical lessons are becoming irrelevant in the world we're living in now, but they certainly don't lend much hope to.
You are right that in mathematical terms, we can't be sure what will happen next. But I think you are putting a lot of faith in the state to have driven the changes that we've seen recently, and you are discounting the role of international organizations like the UN, but like also all the other bureaucracies that respond by the UN. The UN, states didn't just create this peace by themselves. They delegated some of their sovereign power to these organizations that created the guardrails for them, that provided forums for diplomats to meet and work out their disputes, helped create new norms, new understandings of problems, and set out these global bureaucracies where many global civil servants went out and monitored environmental destruction, nuclear non-proliferation, attended to global health, poverty reduction, sustainable development, and did it all through sort of creating this global class of people that were invested in more of a cosmopolitan global ideal. So that is different than earlier eras.
No, I think you're absolutely
and I think
right
some
about
of those
that.
vestiges, the question, the natural experiment we're living through now is, can this continue with the US, for example, pulling out so much of its development aid, pulling out money from peacekeeping, and it remains to be seen. We're going to find out how important the US really was to all of this. But peacekeeping, this is another great example of a tool. We haven't talked about it at all, interestingly. It's one of the most effective tools in human history for preventing civil wars, tamping them down, making sure they end and don't start up again, and making them less deadly. And we know that the less deadly part comes from statistics collected, for example, at the Uppsala conflict data program, where they navigate civilian deaths in many different conflicts. So we know that peacekeeping works, but you probably wouldn't know that by just reading the news, because what gets in the news is the disasters, and there are always some, because it's not a perfect system. It's an imperfect system that has done a lot of good, and that's why I like to temper stories with statistics to give my students perspective. But it also comes back to not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and the stories we tell.
Noha, do you still have faith in the international institutions she's referring to?
I do. I think that they can be important tools to, advocate. I mean, we certainly see this to an extent. I come from an international law background. I'm very much interested in the ICJ and the ICC. I think there's still quite a bit of work to do, but no, I mean, I ultimately, I think that they have their problems for sure. I mean, going back to the example I mentioned earlier with the sanctions against Iraq and the complicity of the UN throughout that decade. But yeah, I mean, just short answer is yes, I do.
Yeah, I do. Yes, I think that their record is spotted with things that aren't great, but generally I think that they've damped down the amount of killing, and along with that killing goes other kinds of displacement and destruction of infrastructure. And so, yes, I think that it has been positive, and I hope it keeps going.
Ian, I think we'd all agree that it's easy for us to talk about this heavy topic around this table. And for so many people, it's a reality of their daily life, living through war, living through the consequences of war. So, can you leave us with some hope? What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that the long-term trends have been clear, that we are living in a world where violence is used to solve problems less and less. And that gives me hope. I mean, it's plenty, I think, still to be anxious about. That, the events going on in the world right now suggest that, clearly we disagree around this table a little bit on what the drivers of this have been, if the phenomenon has happened, what the drivers are. But so many of them seem to be under challenge and under threat at the moment. But this is not the first time this has happened. Obviously, you go back to the 1930s, you see this happening on a scale that were even more terrifying than what is happening in the 2020s. So we were able to recover from that. The world went on after 100 million people had to die to find a solution to the problems that came up in the 1930s. But I remain optimistic. The world is heading in a good direction. It's going to continue doing so. And maybe we'll never get to the point where nobody ever decides that violence is an appropriate way to solve a problem. But surely just moving in that direction has got to be a good thing.
Charlie, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I'll give you a couple of things. I teach classes on the rules of war, and I'm always hopeful when I teach them. And I stay hopeful even when conflict actors in the news cycle are violating the rules of war every day. And the reason is that those rules are very helpful for audiences as well as conflict actors because they allow us to have more empathetic, accountable conversations. The reasons for that is that the rules on how you conduct war are separate from the rules on starting a war. And it means that even if you're fighting a just war, you have to fight through just means. So it means you can't excuse yourself if you're following the rules properly just because you think you're justified, just because someone did something to you. The rules apply to you no matter what. And when audiences and when citizens remind ourselves, understand that, then it does a number of things. It sort of shakes up the us-them black and white thinking. It allows us to see the humanity in the other. It forces us to hold our own troops accountable, which is really the most effective way we can fight atrocities. And it allows us to direct the tools of justice at individual perpetrators instead of whole societies, which is how you prevent genocide. And it sounds a little bit utopian, and it is. It's not easy, but it's also not just lip service. It's not just slogans. There's a lot of political science research that shows international humanitarian law standards can work this way. Conflict actors sometimes do follow them, and citizens can make a big difference in that. But it's not easy because our psychology that we evolved with makes it hard. It's much easier to close ranks and be loyal to your in-group, etc. But if soldiers can be asked to do that on the battlefield, to sort of see the humanity in the enemy as soon as they've dropped their weapon, and actually feed and take care of them, or disobey unlawful orders as they're required to do and often do, then I think citizens can do that as well. And that's what I teach my students. And that gives me hope. I also get hope. I mean, could I say something about what I wish as well? I think that what gives me hope and what would give more people hope is having better stories about the future, about war. I've noticed, you mentioned Top Gun earlier, a lot of the stories we see in Hollywood, not even about war, but just about the future lately in the last decade or so, have been really dystopian and grim and Hobbesian. And this is what we're feeding the next generation. But I grew up on Star Trek, and that was a protopian show. And there's very few shows like that. I want more of those. I want shows. I want fictional narratives that would show us a world where flawed but striving institutions, peopled by bureaucrats that are doing their best and just facing political and ethical and social and post-colonial dilemmas and managing them, navigating them. These institutions are actually aspiring to a just, sustainable, peaceful world. And I want my children and grandchildren to be watching those stories and thinking about how to build those worlds. I think that those kind of stories changing those narratives will help prepare them to build that world. And that's the world I want my grandchildren growing up in.
Well, these days I'm not very optimistic given what's been happening with the United States. But I think if I can go a little long run, not very long durée, but just some, is that these will pass. And I think that all wars are waged according to rules, even if those rules involve great torture and inhumanity to the enemy. And I think that we have globally evolved so that you don't kill and torture your enemies. Those can be subverted. Like in Colombia, one of the things that they told soldiers in the military academy was, if you're going to kill everybody in the village, don't do it all at once. Do it a few at a time so it won't be a massacre. That can happen. But I think that working towards a global sense, and there's, despite my pessimism, you see a tremendous amount of feeling to look at what's really happening with just the starvation in Gaza has motivated an awful lot of people. And if it hadn't, then then there would really be room for despair. But I think that we have to push those things forward to, as we used to say, keep the faith, baby. And I think that where we are now is not where we're going to be 15 years from now or 30 years from now. And I don't see any imminent death of war coming up, but it could be a lot better off. And for people in many places around the world, as I said before, because I was focused on this work at the height of the decompression effect between when the Soviet Union evaporated and left many of client states floundering against other groups within the countries. It used to be a lot worse. And it used to be much more pessimistic. I remember there was a very influential article that came out about 1992 by Kaplan, which said, we're going to see what's happening right now in Liberia, which is going to totally collapse. It didn't. It's doing pretty well right now, but that's going to be the case for all of West Africa, and then all of Africa, and then all around the world, and it's going to come to the United States too. The view that this is the wave of anarchy or the class of civilizations that Huntington talked about, that hasn't materialized. And I think we call attention to the fact that many of the things that have scared us in the past, and this is, I would like to see get some attention. Why did we go into Vietnam? Why were we in Vietnam? Because of the domino theory. If Vietnam went communist, then will Cambodia, and then will South America, and then your backyard. Why were we in Iraq? Because of weapons of mass destruction. Poof, they weren't there. Why Afghanistan? Well, the Taliban is sponsor of global terrorists, and they're going to come after us at home. Hasn't happened. And one of the things that I think is remarkable is that people can use these rationales for a massive war effort. And when the war ends, the rationales go away, and no one says, that wasn't really true. If we could inoculate people somehow against buying into the stories that the leaders are offering, the rationales for why we've got to go to war this time, that I think would be progress. And I think for a lot of people, it has. I mean, I've written about this quite a bit, and I get feedback on it, and some people anyway, have listened to it. So you keep trying.
In some ways, I guess part of what you're maybe referring to is the information warfare, which we haven't really.
Well, it's information warfare, but I think it's more of an ideology which is kind of, I mean, information warfare, I think, is targeted towards the enemy. That's just what I think of it. But the framing of the narrative on what a conflict situation is about for the people who are being asked to go to war. If that's part of information warfare, then yes. But that's where I think it has to be fought. Don't believe the leaders when they say this is why we've got to go to war. Don't believe them. Ask yourself, how do they benefit from the course they are advocating?
Noha, final thoughts?
I was just going to say that I think that we all agree that war doesn't occur in a vacuum. And I think what's nice about nice is not the appropriate word to use in the context of what we're talking about. But what is important about these conversations is that they're as interdisciplinary as possible. So we have the anthropologist, the political scientist, historian, because war is so social and so legal and so political, you need to have these interdisciplinary conversations, especially when you're assessing what the trajectory is looking like, what is the impact of war, whether it's inevitable, necessary. And so and related to this, I would just say that, our understanding of what war is really needs to evolve. And our understanding of what violence is and what the sort of lived realities in most of the world of what violence is, that needs to be front and center when we have these conversations about war.
Thank you all very much. It was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
A pleasure.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.